The Lonely God, Agatha Christie. He stood on a shelf in the British Museum, lonely and forgotten amidst a crowd of far more significant deities. These more important personages, displayed along the walls of the glass case, seemed positioned specifically to project their own overwhelming superiority. At the base of each, a proper label identified the country and the people who once had the honor of possessing said idol. There was no doubt as to their true standing. They were significant deities, universally recognized as such. Only this one little god in the corner looked like an outsider, a stranger to their circle. Roughly hewn from gray stone, his features nearly erased by time and the elements, he sat there in total oblivion, elbows resting on his knees, palms supporting his head, a small, lonely god in a foreign land. He had no label to announce where he had come from, unwanted, obscure, and inglorious. He was merely a pathetic little figure a long way from home. No one noticed him. No one stopped to look. And why should they? He was just an unremarkable stump of gray stone in a corner. On either side of him rose two Mexican deities, polished by time, impassive idols with folded arms, their mouths twisted into cruel sneers that spoke clearly of their utter contempt for the human race. There was also a small, pot-bellied god nearby, bursting with fierce need for self-assertion, one hand clenched in a fist, clearly tormented by a bloated sense of his own importance. Visitors would occasionally stop to look at him, if only to be amused by his foolish pomposity, which seemed so absurd next to the stoicism of his Mexican neighbors. But the little forgotten god sat among them in utter hopelessness, head propped in his hands, year after year, until something incredible happened, and he found himself a worshiper. "Are there any letters for me?" The porter pulled a bundle of mail from a desk drawer, glanced through them, and reported in a wooden voice, "Nothing for you, sir." Frank Oliver sighed as he stepped out of the club and back onto the street. Actually, he had no real reason to expect any correspondence. Few people wrote to him. Since returning from Burma in the spring, he felt an ever-growing sense of isolation. Frank Oliver was just over 40, and he had spent the last 18 years of his life in various corners of the globe, visiting England only for brief intervals during his leaves. Now that he had retired and returned home for good, he felt, for the first time in his life, just how alone in the world he truly was. He did have a sister, Greta, married to a Yorkshire clergyman and perpetually preoccupied with parish affairs and the upbringing of her children. Naturally, Greta loved her only brother, but equally naturally, she could spare him very little time. Then there was his old friend Tom Harley, married to a sweet, cheerful woman of a very energetic and practical disposition, whom Frank secretly feared a little. She would briskly tell Frank that he shouldn't remain a stuffy old bachelor, and was constantly hunting for nice girls for him. He invariably found he had absolutely nothing to say to them, and the nice girls, after struggling with him for a while, eventually gave up on him as a hopeless case. Despite all this, he wasn't antisocial. He craved friendship and understanding, and ever since his return to England, he had felt an increasing spiritual dissatisfaction. He had been away too long, and could no longer find his rhythm with the times. He spent whole days wandering aimlessly through the streets, wondering what on earth to do with himself. It was on one such day that he wandered into the British Museum. He had always had an interest in Asian curiosities, and it so happened that his eyes fell upon the lonely god. Frank was instantly captivated by its charm. He sensed something subtly kindred in it. Here, too, was someone lost and languishing in a land not his own. It became his habit to drop into the museum frequently, just to look at the small gray stone carving perched in a dark corner on the top shelf. A dreary fate for the little fellow, Frank thought to himself. Once, surely, he was surrounded by care and attention. They showered him with gifts and bowed to the ground before him. He became so attached to his little friend that he began to view him almost as personal property, and he was distinctly annoyed to discover that the little idol had won another devotee. After all, it was he, Frank, who had discovered him first. No one else had the right to intrude upon their union. But after the first flash of indignation, he laughed at his own jealousy. For this second worshipper was a mere slip of a girl, a funny, pitiable creature in a frayed black jacket and a worn skirt. She was young, barely over 20 as far as he could tell, with fair hair, blue eyes, and the mournfully drooping corners of a mouth. Her hat, in particular, was a plea for compassion. The girl had evidently tried to trim it herself, and her desperate attempt to look presentable was touching in its failure. She was clearly a lady, despite her obvious poverty, and Frank decided then and there that she must be a governess and was utterly alone in the world. He soon discovered that she visited the god on Tuesdays and Fridays, always arriving at 10 in the morning, just as the museum opened. At first, her intrusion displeased Frank, but gradually an interest in her awoke within him, becoming almost a main event of his monotonous life. Indeed, the god's new admirers soon began to displace the object of worship itself in Frank's heart. The days when he did not see the little lonely lady, as he had christened her, felt empty. Perhaps she was no less interested in him, though she tried hard to hide it under a mask of indifference. Slowly, however, a sense of kinship began to grow between them, even though they had not yet exchanged a single word. To tell the truth, the fault lay entirely with him. He was immensely shy. Frank tried to reason with himself. She probably hadn't even noticed him, though his intuition told him otherwise. She would surely find it a great impertinence if he spoke to her, and finally, he simply had no idea what to say. The stratagem of the lace handkerchief, but fate, or perhaps the little idol himself, proved merciful and granted him a flash of inspiration. At least, that was how it appeared to him. Immensely pleased with his own ingenuity, Frank purchased a lady's handkerchief, a tiny, ethereal thing of cambric and lace that he was almost afraid to touch. Armed with this trophy, he followed the lonely lady as she prepared to leave, intercepting her in the Egyptian gallery. "I beg your pardon, but is this yours?" He attempted to ask the question with breezy indifference, a feat in which he failed most brilliantly. The lonely lady took the handkerchief, making a show of examining it with the utmost gravity. "No, it isn't mine." She returned it to Frank, adding, with what he guiltily imagined to be a touch of suspicion, "It's quite new. It still has the price tag on it." But Frank refused to acknowledge defeat. He launched into a torrent of highly plausible explanations. "You see, I picked it up near that large display case. It was lying right by the back leg." Having delivered these specific details, Frank felt a surge of relief. "Since you were standing right there, I naturally thought it must belong to you, so I followed." "No, it isn't mine," she repeated, and then, as if feeling a sense of awkwardness, added, "Thank you, though." A heavy silence followed. The girl stood before him, flushing pink with embarrassment, clearly at a loss for how to retreat without violating the rules of etiquette. Frank made a desperate attempt to seize the moment. Until you appeared, I never dreamed that anyone else in London could possibly care for our lonely little god." She reacted with sudden warmth, her previous reserve forgotten. "Is that what you call him, too?" Even if she had noticed his use of the word "our," she certainly wasn't offended. She had already begun to trust him, and his quiet, "of course," struck her as the most natural answer in the world. Silence fell again, but this time it was born of mutual understanding. It was a lonely lady who eventually broke it, suddenly remembering the conventions of society. She straightened herself primly and, with a cold dignity that was almost amusing in such a petite person, said, "I must be going now. Good day." And with a stiff nod, she marched away, her head held high. By all established standards, Frank Oliver should have accepted this as a total defeat. It was perhaps a regrettable sign of his rapid moral decline that he merely whispered to himself, "The dear little thing," the return to the museum. Soon, however, he had cause to repent his audacity. For 10 long days, his little lady did not show her face at the museum. Frank was in despair. He had frightened her away. Now, surely she would never return. He was a brute, a monster. He would never see her again. Tormented by these doubts, he spent whole days lurking in the British Museum. Perhaps she had simply decided to come at a different hour? Frank soon knew every adjacent gallery by heart and developed a lasting loathing for mummies. A security guard watched him with deep suspicion as he spent 3 solid hours staring intently at Assyrian hieroglyphs, while contemplation of endless rows of vases from every conceivable era nearly drove him mad with boredom. But one day, his patience was rewarded. She reappeared, looking a little more flushed than usual, struggling to maintain her outward composure. He greeted her with joyful friendliness. "Good morning. You haven't been here for an eternity." "Good morning." She tossed a greeting back with icy indifference, pointedly ignoring his remark about her absence. But Frank decided on a desperate move. "Look here." He stepped in front of her, looking down at her with a pleading gaze that made him resemble a large, loyal dog. "Would you mind if we became friends? I'm so lonely in London, all alone in the world, and it seems to me that you are, too. We ought to be friends. Besides, our little god has already introduced us." She looked at him uncertainly, but a timid smile began to flutter at the corners of her mouth. "Has he really?" "Of course." Again, he used that supremely affirmative expression, and just like the first time, it had a disarming effect on her. After a moment's silence, she spoke with her characteristic air of grandiosity. "Very well." "That's wonderful," Frank replied, his voice a bit husky. Something in his tone made the girl flash him a quick, sympathetic look. And so, this strange friendship began. Twice a week, they met at the shrine of the little pagan idol. Initially, their entire conversation centered on him. The god was partly their justification, partly their excuse for meeting. The mystery of his origin was discussed at length. Frank was inclined to bestow upon him the most bloodthirsty traits. He described him as a formidable deity who had inspired terror in his native land, a god hungry for human sacrifice, before whom his people bowed in trembling fear. In Frank's view, the true poignancy of the situation lay in the jarring contrast between his former majesty and his current wretched state. Theories and confessions. The lonely lady could not bring herself to agree with such a grim theory. In her eyes, he was a kind little deity at heart, she insisted. She doubted he had ever been powerful. If he had, she argued, he wouldn't be so forgotten and forsaken now. To her, he was simply a dear little god, and she loved him. It was unbearable to see him sitting there day after day while those terrible, haughty statues mocked him. "Just look at them," she cried, quite breathless after her sudden outburst. When that subject was exhausted, they naturally began to speak of themselves. Frank found that his guess had been correct. She was indeed a governess to a family in Hampstead. Frank took an immediate dislike to those children, 5-year-old Ted, who wasn't actually naughty, just mischievous, the twins, who truly were fretful, and Molly, who never did as she was told, but was such a darling it was impossible to stay cross with her. "Those children are wearing you out," he remarked with a somber, reproachful air. "Not at all," she countered quickly. "I keep them in very strict order." "I'm sure you do." He laughed, and she made him apologize for his sarcasm. She also shared that she was an orphan and quite alone in the world. Gradually, he told her bits of his own life, of his career, where he had been diligent and found some success, and of his leisure time, which he spent fruitlessly smudging canvases. "Of course, I don't really understand the first thing about it," he admitted, "but I've always felt that one day I might paint something real. I can sketch decently enough, but I want to create a true painting. A fellow who knows about these things once told me my technique wasn't half bad." She grew interested and asked for more details. "I'm certain your work must be wonderful." He shook his head. "No, lately I've started several things, only to lose heart and give up. I always thought that when I finally had the time, everything would fall into place. I carried that hope for years, but now it seems I'm too late for that, just as I'm too late for everything else." "It is never too late for anything," the little lady replied with the passionate conviction of youth. He looked at her with a smile. "Do you really think so, child? For me, some things are already far too late." At that, she laughed at him, even going so far as to call him Methuselah, the tea shop rendezvous. They began to feel quite at home in the British Museum. The burly policeman patrolling the galleries was a tactful man. As soon as he spotted the pair, he usually decided that his heavy duties required his immediate presence in the neighboring Assyrian room. One day, Frank ventured a bolder step. He invited her to a cafe for tea. At first, she hesitated. "I don't have the time. I'm never free. I can only slip away occasionally in the mornings while the children have their French lessons." "Nonsense," Frank countered. "You can surely carve out one single day. Invent something, have an aunt or a cousin pass away. Make up whatever you like, but come. We'll go to the little ABC shop nearby and order bath buns with our tea. I'm certain you like bath buns. Yes, the penny ones with the currants. And that lovely sugar glaze on top. They're so fluffy, they're just a delight. In a bath bun," Frank Oliver concluded solemnly, "there is something infinitely cozy." And so they made their arrangement. To mark the occasion, the little governess arrived with a rather expensive hothouse rose pinned to her waist. Frank noticed that a troubled, strained expression had recently clouded her eyes. As she sat at the small marble-top table pouring the tea, it became even more apparent. "Are the children getting the best of you?" he asked solicitously. The girl shook her head. Curiously, she had seemed to avoid talking about the children lately. "They are fine. They don't worry me at all." "Truly?" His sympathetic tone seemed, for some reason, to distress her further. "Oh, no, it isn't the children. But I really have felt very lonely. It's true." Her voice became almost a plea. "I understand, my child," he said softly, moved by her words. I know." After a moment's pause, he remarked cheerfully, "By the way, you haven't even asked my name yet." She raised a hand in protest. "Don't. I don't want to know it. And don't ask mine. Let's just stay two lonely people who happen to meet and become friends. It's much more wonderful that way, and special." "Very well," he said quietly, lost in thought. "Just two souls who found each other in a lonely world." In his voice, her words took on a slightly different meaning. The girl fell silent, embarrassed. She leaned her head lower and lower over her plate, until Frank could see nothing but the crown of her hat. "That's a rather charming hat," Frank remarked encouragingly. "I trimmed it myself," she said with a touch of pride. "I thought as much the moment I saw it," he replied with cheerful simplicity. "I'm afraid it didn't turn out quite as fashionable as I intended. It's a beautiful, lovely hat, if you ask me," he assured her. An awkward silence settled between them again. Frank Oliver broke it bravely. "Little lady, I hadn't intended to say this to you yet, but I can't help myself. I love you. I need you. I've loved you from the very moment I saw you in the museum in your little black suit. It's a wonderful thing when two lonely people find each other, isn't it? Because then they aren't lonely anymore. And I shall work. Oh, how I shall work. I'll paint your portrait. I can do it. I know I can. My dear girl, I cannot live without you. I truly can't." The little lady watched him intently. He expected many things, but certainly not what she said next. Very slowly and deliberately, she murmured, "You bought that handkerchief yourself." He was stunned by her feminine intuition, but even more shocked that she still remembered that awkward episode. Surely, after all this time, she might have forgiven him. "Yes, I did," he admitted guiltily. "I needed a pretext to speak to you. Are you very angry with me?" He fell silent, submissively awaiting her verdict. "I think it was the sweetest thing," the little lady cried with sudden heat. "A terribly sweet thing to do." She faltered uncertainly. "Tell me, my child," Frank continued, his voice slightly husky, "is my wish truly impossible? I know I'm a dull, clumsy old bore." But the lonely lady interrupted him. "No, you aren't, and I don't want anyone else. I love you for exactly who you are. Do you understand? Not because I pity you or because I'm lonely and need someone to care for me, but because you are simply you. Do you understand me? Is it true? he almost whispered. And she answered firmly, "Yes, it is true." Happiness overwhelmed them both. "Then we've found our way to heaven, my dear," he finally said. "In an ABC shop," she replied, her voice trembling with a mixture of laughter and tears. The disappearance. But earthly paradise is fleeting. The little lady suddenly started. "I had no idea it was so late. I must go at once," she cried. "I'll see you home." "No, no, no." He was forced to yield, walking with her only as far as the underground station. "Goodbye, my dear." She squeezed his hand in a fervent grip, a memory he would return often in the days to come. "Only goodbye until tomorrow," he called out joyfully. "At 10 as usual. We'll tell each other our names and everything else. We'll try to be dreadfully practical and prosaic. Until we meet in heaven, then," she whispered. "It's with us forever, my love." She gave him one last smile, the same sad, pleading look that he couldn't quite fathom, leaving with a vague sense of unease. Then the inexorable ribbon of the escalator drew her down, and she vanished from sight. Frank was strangely troubled by her parting words, but he resolutely forced himself to forget them, surrendering instead to radiant dreams of the morning to come. At 10 o'clock, he was standing in their usual spot. For the first time, Frank noticed how maliciously the other idols seemed to leer at him. It was as if they were staring, relishing the knowledge of some sinister secret hanging over him. He felt deeply uneasy, sensing their palpable hostility. The little lady was late. Why wasn't she there? The entire atmosphere of the place felt oppressive. Never had his little friend, their god, seemed so pathetic. What could he really do? After all, this clumsy hunk of stone locked his own grief. Frank's reflections were cut short by a boy with a mischievous face who approached and began to inspect him from head to toe. Apparently satisfied with his scrutiny, he finally held out a letter. "Is this for me?" The envelope was unaddressed. Frank took it, and the boy bolted away with incredible speed. Frank Oliver began to read the short message, his eyes refusing to believe what they saw. "My dearest, I can never marry you. Please, forget entirely that I was ever in your life, and try to forgive me if I have broken your heart. Do not try to find me. It will lead to nothing. I am truly saying goodbye to you forever. The Lonely Lady." At the bottom was a postscript, clearly added at the very last moment. "I love you, it is true." In that small, impulsive postscript, he found his only consolation throughout the following weeks. It goes without saying that he did not heed her plea not to find her, but it was all in vain. She had vanished without a trace, and Frank had no clue where to begin his search. In desperation, he placed advertisements in the newspapers, using veiled language to beg her for an explanation for her mysterious disappearance. But his efforts were met with total silence. She was gone, and she was not coming back. And then, for the first time in his life, Frank began to paint in earnest. He had always possessed a decent technique. Now, mastery walked hand in hand with inspiration. The painting he produced brought him recognition and fame. It was accepted and hung in the Academy, hailed as the picture of the year, not only for its exquisite treatment of the subject, but equally for its masterful execution. A certain air of mystery, in turn, made it even more alluring to the public. The Princess and the painting. The source of his inspiration was quite accidental. A fairy tale in a magazine had captured his imagination. It was a story of a happy princess who had never known the word no. A wish? It was granted instantly. A whim? It was satisfied at once. She had loving parents, exquisite gowns, and slaves waiting to fulfill her every caprice. She was surrounded by smiling maidens and courted by the richest princes, all ready to slay any number of dragons to prove their devotion. And yet, the princess's loneliness was more bitter than that of the lowliest beggar in the land. Frank read no further. The princess's ultimate fate did not interest him. Instead, his mind's eye saw her burdened by the joys of life, a sad, solitary soul suffocating under luxury, parched with thirst in a palace of plenty. He began to paint with a feverish intensity. Frank depicted the princess surrounded by her court, reclining on a divan. The painting overflowed with the riotous colors of the East. Her gown embroidered in fantastical hues, her golden hair spilling over her shoulders, and a jewel-encrusted diadem upon her head. Princes knelt at her feet with lavish gifts. The entire scene breathed wealth and opulence. But the princess's face was turned away. Her gaze was fixed upon a dark, shadowed corner where stood the most incongruous object, a small idol of gray stone, sitting with its head in its hands, looking unutterably lost. The eyes of the young princess rested upon him with a strange, soulful sympathy, as if her own loneliness had irresistibly chained her sight to his. They were kindred spirits. The world lay at her feet, and yet she was alone. The lonely princess, watching the lonely little god. The vision in lace. All of London began to talk about the painting. Greta sent hasty congratulations from Yorkshire, and Tom Harley's wife begged Frank to come for the weekend to meet a charming girl who was a great admirer of your work. Frank merely gave a grim, sarcastic laugh and threw the letter into the fire. Success had come, but what was it to him? He wanted only the little lonely lady who had vanished from his life. On the opening day of the Ascot races, a policeman on duty in the British Museum rubbed his eyes, convinced he was dreaming. One does not expect to see an Ascot vision in a lace dress and a marvelous hat, a true Parisian nymph, wander in the halls of antiquity. The lonely god, however, was likely not so surprised. Perhaps he possessed more power than Frank had imagined. At any rate, he had managed to call back one of his worshippers. The little lonely lady stood before him, her lips moving in a rapid, pleading whisper. "Dear little god, please help me. Please help." Perhaps the idol was flattered. Perhaps, if he truly had been the fierce deity Frank once imagined, the long years of civilization had softened his stone heart. Or perhaps the lady had been right all along, and he was simply a kind little god. Whatever the cause, it was at that exact moment that Frank Oliver walked slowly and dejectedly out of the Syrian room. He raised his head and saw the nymph. In the next heartbeat, his arms were around her, and she was sobbing breathlessly. "I was so lonely, you know that now. You must have read the little story I wrote. You couldn't have painted that picture otherwise. The princess, that's me. I had everything, but I was so unutterably alone. One day, I went to a fortune-teller and borrowed a suit from my maid. On the way, I came in here and saw you looking at the little god. That's how it all began. I pretended. Oh, it was so wicked of me to be a poor governess, and later I didn't dare confess the lie. I thought you would be disgusted. I thought if you found me out, I couldn't bear it, so I fled. Then I wrote that story, and yesterday I saw your painting. It was you who painted it, wasn't it? The sacrifice of the god. Only the gods truly know the meaning of the word, ingratitude. One must assume the lonely little god learned it well that day. As a deity, he had unique opportunities to observe the human heart. Yet he, who had once looked upon countless sacrifices as honor, now made a sacrifice of his own. He gave up the only two worshippers he had in this foreign land. He proved his greatness by surrendering everything he possessed. Through the fingers that veiled his face, he watched them go, hand in hand, without a single backward glance. Two happy people who had found their paradise and therefore needed no one else. After all, who was he? Only a very lonely little god in a foreign land.